I'm going crazy missing you. The whisper came softly through the phone, intimate enough to make my stomach twist before I even understood why. I stood frozen in the middle of a cold hospital waiting room, rainwater dripping from strangers' coats onto the tile floor, while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. For 1 second, I couldn't breathe. Then I tightened my grip around the cracked pink phone in my hand and answered in a voice so calm it frightened even me. She can't come to the phone anymore. Silence exploded on the other end. I slowly looked through the ICU glass doors where doctors rushed around a woman fighting for her life. A woman my husband loved behind my back. A woman whose phone I was holding while she lay unconscious after a brutal car accident. Before they took her into surgery, I continued coldly. She sent me everything. The sound Ethan made after that didn't sound like guilt at first. It sounded like fear. Real fear. Not once did he ask who Vanessa was. Not once did he pretend he didn't know her. And in that moment, every tiny suspicion I had buried over the past year rose to the surface like bodies floating after a storm. The late-night business trips, the locked phone, the sudden cologne. The distance in his eyes, every time he sat across from me at dinner pretending everything was normal. 12 years of marriage collapsed silently inside my chest while hospital machines beeped somewhere down the hall. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash every framed family photo hanging in our suburban home. But instead, I sat there perfectly still, staring at rain sliding down the windows, while my husband whispered into another woman's phone, asking only one thing: is she alive? That question changed everything. Because good husbands panic for their wives. Guilty men panic for secrets. A state trooper had called me less than an hour earlier, telling me a woman named Vanessa Cole listed me as her emergency contact before losing consciousness after a violent crash on Interstate 88. I almost told him he had the wrong number. I didn't know any Vanessa Cole. At least I thought I didn't. But when I arrived at the hospital, they handed me her purse, her phone, and a folded note with my name, written across the front. Inside was a password. Nothing else. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the phone unlocking it. Then I found the email waiting for me. Photos of Ethan kissing her in hotel mirrors, bank transfers, secret recordings. Lies stacked on top of lies until I no longer recognized the man I had shared a bed with for over a decade. And beneath all of it, one sentence that made my blood run cold. I think your husband is in serious trouble, and I think he planned to drag me down with him. That was the exact moment my marriage stopped being a story about cheating and became something far darker. And trust me, what Rachel discovers next will completely change the way you see Ethan forever. If you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal secrets, revenge, and shocking twists, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for the next part, because this nightmare is only beginning. The first photo shattered me before I even had time to breathe. Ethan's hand was wrapped around Vanessa's waist, his face buried against hers, in the reflection of a polished hotel mirror, while soft golden lobby lights glowed behind them, like something romantic from a movie. Except this wasn't romance, it was evidence. Cold, brutal evidence that my husband had been living another life while I folded laundry, packed school lunches, and defended his late-night business meetings to anyone who questioned them. My fingers trembled so badly, I nearly dropped Vanessa's phone onto the hospital floor. Around me, nurses rushed through the ICU hallway while thunder rattled faintly outside the windows. But all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding louder and louder inside my skull. Then I swiped to the next image. Bank transfers. Large ones. Thousands of dollars moving between accounts I didn't recognize. Some were labeled consulting payments. Others had no explanation at all. Every screenshot carried dates stretching back almost 2 years. 2 years of lies hidden beneath normal family dinners and polite suburban smiles. My stomach twisted violently as a horrifying realization crept through me. This wasn't just an affair anymore. Vanessa hadn't sent me proof to expose a cheating husband. She sent me a warning. I opened the first audio file with shaking hands. Static crackled softly before Vanessa's voice filled the phone speaker. "If Rachel is hearing this," she whispered, "then something already went wrong." I froze instantly. There was no triumph in her voice, no bitterness, only exhaustion and fear so raw it crawled beneath my skin. She explained how she met Ethan during a healthcare conference in Milwaukee. At first he seemed perfect, attentive, intelligent, kind in that polished way successful men often are. He remembered small details. He listened carefully. He made her feel safe after a painful divorce, left her emotionally wrecked. But slowly, the relationship changed. Ethan started confiding in her about stress at work, financial pressure, fear of losing everything he had built. Vanessa said she believed she was helping him survive a difficult period. Instead, she was being pulled into something dangerous. The second recording hit even harder. Vanessa revealed Ethan had been secretly moving company money between vendor accounts to hide financial losses connected to his job. At first she claimed she didn't fully understand what he was asking her to do. He framed everything as temporary, simple favors, short-term solutions until his company stabilized. But over time, her name became connected to transfers investigators could eventually trace back to fraud. My blood turned cold, listening to her voice crack with panic. I told him I wanted out, she whispered through tears. But then he reminded me my name was attached to everything too. Suddenly, memories I once ignored came rushing back with terrifying clarity. Ethan pacing our kitchen at 2 a.m. The bourbon bottles hidden deeper in the cabinet. His explosive temper over tiny problems that never used to bother him. I thought he was drifting away because he stopped loving me. The truth was worse. He was drowning. And instead of facing the consequences alone, he dragged another woman into the water beside him. Then came the final recording, the one Vanessa captured accidentally inside her car only hours before the crash. Rain hammered against the windshield, while both of them argued in tense silence. Vanessa's voice shook as she whispered, "I can't do this anymore." Ethan answered immediately, cold and controlled. "You're overreacting." "No," she fired back, nearly sobbing now. "I'm terrified." Then came a silence so heavy it made my chest ache. Finally Ethan spoke again, his voice flatter than I had ever heard it before. "You don't get to walk away after everything I risked for you." I stopped breathing. In that instant, I no longer saw my husband. I saw a man desperate to protect the collapsing version of himself no matter who got destroyed in the process. And somehow that realization hurt even more than the affair itself. If you think Rachel should expose everything Ethan has done, comment number 1 below, because what happens next will destroy far more than just their marriage. You manipulated her. The words came out of my mouth before I even realized I was speaking them aloud. Ethan stood across from me in the dim hospital waiting room, his tie crooked, exhaustion carved deep beneath his eyes, while rain battered the windows behind him. For a moment he said nothing. He just stared at me like a man trying to calculate which lie might still save him. But the terrifying thing was, I no longer wanted excuses. I wanted the truth. The real truth hiding underneath months of distant secret phone calls and smiles that suddenly felt rehearsed. "Rachel," he whispered carefully, lowering his voice, as if softer words could somehow soften betrayal itself. "You don't understand the pressure I was under." I almost laughed. Pressure. Such a clean little word for the wreckage standing between us. Upstairs, Vanessa was recovering from emergency surgery after driving through a storm while emotionally shattered by the man she trusted. Federal investigators were already circling Ethan's company. Our daughter was at school being forced to hear whispers about her father. And somehow Ethan still spoke like a businessman, trying to manage a difficult quarter, instead of a husband who detonated his own family. "Pressure," I repeated quietly. "You had an affair for nearly 2 years. His jaw tightened immediately. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Nothing ever is." He looked away after that, and somehow that tiny movement hurt more than shouting would have, because guilt lives inside avoidance. I stepped closer, lowering my voice, so only he could hear me. I listened to the recordings. The color drained from his face so fast it frightened me. Every trace of control vanished instantly. "Rachel." "No," I interrupted sharply. "Don't you dare start lying again." His breathing turned uneven. Around us, nurses pushed carts through the hallway, while televisions muttered quietly from distant waiting areas. But inside that moment, it felt like the world narrowed down to 2 exhausted strangers, staring at the ruins of a marriage. "She was scared of you," I whispered. Ethan flinched like I had physically hit him. "I never hurt her. You trapped her. That's not fair." "Fair?" I stared at him in disbelief. "You manipulated a woman into helping you hide financial fraud. then convinced yourself you were the victim, because life got stressful. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face before answering. I didn't mean for things to spiral. There it was again. Not accountability. Not remorse. Just another man describing destruction as though it accidentally happened to him instead of because of him. Do you even hear yourself anymore? I asked quietly. For several seconds he remained silent. Then finally something inside him cracked. I was terrified, he admitted. The confession came out broken and small, nothing like the confident corporate executive everyone else knew. The company was failing. Numbers stopped making sense. I thought if I could just fix things temporarily, I could protect all of us before anyone got hurt. And Vanessa, his eyes closed briefly. At first she made me feel like I wasn't drowning. That answer hit me harder than I expected, because buried inside it was the ugliest truth of all. Ethan didn't fall in love with Vanessa. He fell in love with the version of himself he could pretend to be around her, successful, in control, admired, needed. And when she wanted to leave, I asked softly. His shoulders collapsed slightly. I panicked. Finally. Honesty. Not complete honesty, but enough to expose the frightened man underneath the polished surface. Ethan had spent years building an image so carefully that he no longer knew who he was without it. The affair wasn't just betrayal, it was escape. Vanessa wasn't just his mistress. She was proof he could still pretend everything was fine, while his entire life quietly rotted underneath him. And somehow realizing that hurt worse than hatred ever could. Because monsters are easier to leave than broken people you once loved. If this part of the story hit you emotionally, take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because what Rachel discovers about Ethan's financial crimes is about to change everything forever. The moment the federal agents walked into the hospital, I realized this nightmare was far bigger than an affair. Two people in dark coats moved quietly through the waiting room, with the kind of calm that only comes from dealing with disasters every single day. One of them held a leather folder thick enough to ruin lives. The other scanned the room until her eyes landed directly on Ethan. And in that instant, my husband, the confident executive who used to command conference rooms without breaking eye contact, looked terrified. Truly terrified. Ethan Bennett, the woman asked calmly. The entire room seemed to freeze around us. Ethan stood slowly from his chair, but I noticed something most people would have missed. His hands were shaking, not with anger, not with frustration. Fear. Real fear. The woman introduced herself as Special Agent Karen Douglas from the Department of Justice Financial Crimes Division. Just hearing those words made my stomach tighten. Financial crimes. Suddenly all those secretive late-night calls, business trips, hidden accounts, and unexplained tension inside our marriage rearranged themselves into something horrifyingly clear. This wasn't a reckless mistake anymore. This was criminal. We'd like to ask you a few questions regarding several financial transfers connected to MedTech Solutions, she said evenly. Ethan swallowed hard before answering. My lawyer isn't here. That response alone told me everything. Innocent people ask what's happening. Guilty people ask for lawyers. The agents guided him toward a quieter consultation room down the hallway, but before disappearing through the door, Ethan looked back at me. And for the first time since all of this began, I saw the mask slip completely. No arrogance, no manipulation, no carefully rehearsed calm, just panic. Hours passed after that. Long, suffocating hours filled with the sounds of hospital monitors, ringing phones, distant footsteps, and my own thoughts tearing me apart from the inside. At one point my daughter called crying because another student had shown her an online post claiming her father was involved in fraud. I sat alone in a hospital bathroom afterward, trying not to break down loud enough for strangers to hear. That was the cruelest part of betrayal. It spreads. Everyone close enough gets burned eventually. By the afternoon, pieces of Ethan's secret life began falling into place faster than I could process them. Vanessa hadn't just been emotionally trapped. She had been financially tied to him through hidden vendor accounts connected to suspicious company transfers. According to the recording she left behind, Ethan convinced her these transactions were temporary solutions while his company recovered from financial problems. But temporary lies have a way of becoming permanent disasters. Investigators apparently believed Ethan had been quietly moving company money between accounts to hide losses after a failed acquisition deal. The deeper he sank, the more desperate he became. And desperate people stop thinking about morality. They think about survival. Suddenly, memories I once dismissed became impossible to ignore. Ethan snapping at tiny inconveniences, the bourbon bottles multiplying in the garage cabinet, the nights he sat awake staring blankly at spreadsheets long after everyone else slept. I thought stress was damaging our marriage. I never imagined fear was poisoning him from the inside. Then another terrifying thought hit me. Vanessa's crash might not have been random at all. Maybe Ethan never touched her physically. Maybe he never intended real harm. But emotional pressure can destroy people just as effectively as violence. According to the final recording, Vanessa had been sobbing alone inside her car moments before driving into a storm after arguing with Ethan. She sounded exhausted, cornered, broken, and Ethan knew it. That realization changed the shape of my anger completely. Affairs happen every day. People cheat, people lie. But this was different. Ethan didn't just betray people who loved him. He pulled them into the collapse of his own identity because he couldn't bear to fail alone. And the most chilling part, I honestly don't think he realized how dangerous he had become until everything exploded. By evening, Ethan finally emerged from the consultation room looking pale and hollow. He opened his mouth, like he wanted to explain something, but I raised my hand before he could speak, because for the first time in our entire marriage, I no longer trusted a single word coming out of his mouth. What do you think? Was Ethan a victim of pressure? Or did he slowly become the kind of man he always feared being? Comment your opinion below, because the next part of this story gets even darker. I tried to leave him. Vanessa's voice barely rose above a whisper. When the nurse finally allowed me into her hospital room, for a moment I simply stood there frozen beside the doorway, staring at the woman I had imagined hating for the rest of my life. But nothing about the scene in front of me looked glamorous or victorious. Bruises darkened one side of her face. Tubes disappeared beneath stiff white blankets. Her blonde hair hung tangled around exhausted eyes, swollen from crying. This wasn't the seductive woman I had built inside my nightmares while wondering why my husband stopped looking at me the same way. This was a human being who looked completely shattered. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence between us, while rain slid slowly down the hospital windows behind her bed. Vanessa swallowed painfully before speaking again. "You have to believe me," she whispered. Near the end, I was terrified of him. Those words hit me harder than any confession about the affair itself. Because fear changes everything. Affairs are ugly, selfish, cruel even. But fear belongs to something darker. I pulled a chair closer to the bed without saying anything at first. Part of me still wanted to scream at her, to demand why she answered Ethan's texts, why she continued seeing a married man, why she ignored the warning signs any woman should recognize. But another part of me already knew the answer. People don't walk willingly into destruction all at once. They slide there slowly, one compromise at a time, until they barely recognize themselves anymore. Vanessa turned her face slightly toward the window, shame flickering across her bruised expression. "At first he made me feel safe," she admitted quietly. "He listened to me. He remembered things. After my divorce I felt invisible, and Ethan made me feel important again." I closed my eyes briefly, because I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. Ethan had always known how to make people feel chosen. That was his gift, and eventually his weapon. "When did things change?" I asked softly. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the hospital blanket. When I started asking questions, she explained how Ethan slowly involved her in financial transfers, tied to company accounts, always presenting them as temporary solutions to stressful problems at work. At first, she believed him. He sounded convincing, calm, rational, like a man simply trying to survive impossible pressure. But then the transfers grew larger, more complicated, more dangerous, and every time she hesitated, Ethan found a way to pull her back emotionally. He kept saying we were in it together, she whispered, that if everything collapsed, both our lives would be ruined. There it was again, the manipulation hidden beneath love. Ethan didn't control people through shouting or violence. He controlled them through dependence, through guilt, through making them believe leaving him would destroy everything. Vanessa wiped tears carefully from her swollen face before continuing. The night before the accident, I told him I wanted out completely. My stomach tightened instantly. What did he say? For several seconds, she said nothing. Then finally, he got cold. That answer chilled me more than if she had described screaming, because some people become terrifying precisely when they stop showing emotion. Vanessa stared down at her trembling hands. He told me I didn't get to walk away after everything he risked for me. I felt something inside my chest twist painfully, because suddenly the final recording made horrifying sense. Ethan wasn't trying to save Vanessa anymore. He was trying to save himself, and anyone threatening the illusion he built became dangerous to him. I drove away crying, Vanessa admitted softly. I could barely see the road because of the rain. The room fell silent after that, except for the steady rhythm of hospital machines. I looked at the woman lying in front of me and realized something I never expected. We were both victims of the same broken man. Different roles. Same damage. Vanessa turned toward me, slowly, eyes filled with shame. I know you probably hate me. I thought about that for a long moment before answering honestly. I did, I admitted quietly. But now, I think you were drowning too. The tears that filled her eyes after that looked less like guilt and more like relief. And maybe that was the cruelest truth of all. By the end, nobody in Ethan's world felt loved anymore. They only felt trapped. By the time Ethan finally came home, he no longer looked like the man I married. The expensive confidence was gone. The polished corporate smile had disappeared. Even the way he walked through the front door felt different now, slower, heavier, like someone carrying invisible ruins on his back. Federal investigators had seized his work laptop that morning. Several bank accounts connected to the company investigation were frozen. His employer placed him on indefinite leave, while auditors searched through years of financial records. And suddenly, the man who once obsessed over stock prices and executive dinners sat silently at our kitchen table, staring into nothing, like a stranger who had lost his entire identity overnight. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the house remained painfully quiet around us. Upstairs, my daughter barely left her room anymore. She moved through the house with headphones on, avoiding Ethan completely except for short, awkward exchanges during dinner. Children always notice when adults become morally smaller. They may not understand every detail, but they feel the shift instantly. Ethan tried pretending things were still manageable during those first days back home. He spoke carefully, calmly, using the same controlled tone he probably used in board meetings. The investigation might not become public, he muttered one evening, while loosening his tie with trembling hands. I stared at him in disbelief. Public. That was what he was worried about. Not the marriage collapsing, not Vanessa nearly dying, not the emotional wreckage spreading through our family. His reputation. That was still the center of his universe. People already know, I answered quietly. He frowned. What do you mean? Before I could respond, my phone vibrated with another message from a neighbor, pretending to check in. Earlier that day, someone had posted a blurry photo online, showing Ethan entering the hospital beside a headline, connecting him to a corporate fraud investigation. By afternoon, gossip spread through our subdivision like wildfire. Parents whispered during soccer practice. Neighbors suddenly became overly polite when I walked outside. Even grocery store cashiers looked at me differently, with that uncomfortable mixture of pity and curiosity people save for public humiliation. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face after I showed him the article. Jesus Christ, he whispered. But strangely, I no longer felt the urge to comfort him. For years I had protected this man, emotionally smoothing over his stress, defending his long absences, convincing myself every marriage went through difficult seasons. Now I realized I had been protecting an illusion. Later that night, I found him sitting alone in the guest room, surrounded by stacks of paperwork investigators requested from his lawyers. The room smelled faintly of whiskey and exhaustion. Did you ever plan on telling me the truth? I asked from the doorway. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He kept staring down at the papers like numbers might somehow rescue him. Finally, quietly, I thought I could fix it before you found out. That sentence broke something inside me completely, because it revealed how deeply he misunderstood everything. He still thought the problem was discovery. Not deception, not manipulation, Not the years of lies poisoning every corner of our lives. You didn't just hide an affair, I whispered. You built an entirely fake reality around us. Ethan's eyes finally lifted toward me, then filled with exhaustion so deep it almost looked physical. I never wanted to hurt you. I laughed softly under my breath. That's the tragedy, Ethan. I think you believe that. Silence swallowed the room after that. Outside, snow had started falling lightly across the backyard, covering the dead winter grass in fragile white layers. Ethan looked smaller, somehow sitting there alone, beneath the dim lamplight, stripped of the confidence he spent years constructing. But for the first time since all of this began, I understood something clearly. His greatest fear had never been losing me. It was losing the image of himself he worked so desperately to maintain. And once that image shattered, everything else collapsed with it. The marriage, the career, the affair, even his relationship with our daughter. Because eventually lies stop protecting you. They start consuming you instead. What do you think? Should Rachel have stayed and supported Ethan through the investigation, or was walking away the only possible choice? After so much betrayal, comment your opinion below. I don't think your father is evil. The moment those words left my mouth, my daughter looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. She sat curled up on the floor beside her bed, tears sliding silently down her face, while cruel headlines about Ethan glowed across her phone screen. Outside her bedroom window, snow drifted slowly beneath the streetlights covering the neighborhood, in the kind of peaceful silence that feels almost insulting when your life is falling apart. How can you even say that? She whispered shakily. After everything he did to us, I sat down carefully beside her, staring at the same headlines spreading across social media like wildfire. Cheating executive, linked to fraud investigation. Corporate scandal rocks suburban family. Every article reduced our lives into gossip for strangers to consume over morning coffee. But the worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was watching my child slowly lose faith in the idea that adults could be trusted at all. Because hatred changes people, I answered quietly. And I don't want what he did to poison who you become. She wiped her eyes angrily. But he lied to everyone. I know. He ruined everything. That part hurt because it was true. Ethan hadn't just destroyed a marriage. He shattered the emotional foundation of our home. For years, our daughter believed her father was dependable, successful, strong, the kind of man who fixed problems instead of creating them. Now she was discovering something most people spend their entire lives trying not to learn: adults are capable of becoming strangers without warning. Downstairs, I could hear Ethan moving quietly through the kitchen. Ever since returning home during the investigation, he carried himself differently, almost like someone afraid to take up too much space inside his own house. The confidence was gone now. The easy laughter, the polished certainty. In its place was exhaustion so deep it followed him from room to room like a shadow. But strangely, watching him fall apart no longer brought me satisfaction, only sadness. Because despite everything, I still remembered the version of Ethan who once drove through a snowstorm because our daughter forgot a school project. The man who danced badly with me in the kitchen while pasta boiled on the stove. The husband who used to kiss my forehead absent-mindedly before leaving for work every morning. That man had been real too. And maybe that was the hardest part of all. People don't destroy their lives all at once, I said softly, after a long silence. It happens gradually. One bad decision, then another, then eventually they wake up, surrounded by consequences they barely recognize. My daughter stared down at her phone for several seconds before whispering, "So you forgive him?" I thought about that question carefully because forgiveness is far more complicated than people pretend. Not yet, I admitted honestly. Maybe not for a long time. Then I looked toward the bedroom door, where faint kitchen light spilled into the hallway. But forgiving someone doesn't mean trusting them again. That distinction mattered. Ethan had spent years believing love would survive anything as long as he could maintain control of the image he built around himself. But trust doesn't collapse dramatically. It erodes quietly, one lie at a time, until eventually nothing solid remains underneath. Later that night, after my daughter finally fell asleep, I walked downstairs and found Ethan sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee. He looked up slowly when he heard my footsteps. "How is she?" he asked quietly. I folded my arms against the cold air coming through the window. "Heartbroken." Ethan closed his eyes like the word physically hurt him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then finally, barely above a whisper, I never wanted her to hate me. I stared at him for a long moment before answering. That stopped being your choice a long time ago. His face collapsed after that. Not dramatically, just slowly, like a man finally understanding the true cost of everything he destroyed. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something painful. Ethan's greatest punishment wasn't losing his career or reputation, it was becoming someone his own family no longer recognized. If this chapter hit you emotionally, don't forget to like and subscribe for the next part. Because Rachel is about to make a decision that changes all of their lives forever. The moment I opened Ethan's office closet, I realized my marriage had been built on performance for far longer than I ever understood. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal. Expensive suits lined up with obsessive precision-polished shoes, arranged beneath hanging shirts, stacks of business magazines, sitting neatly beside old conference binders. The life of a successful executive. The image Ethan spent years carefully constructing. But hidden behind a row of storage boxes in the back corner sat something I had never seen before, a locked metal case. My stomach tightened instantly. Even after everything that happened, the affair, the investigation, the lies, part of me still wanted to believe there were limits Ethan would never cross. That illusion died the second I forced the case open. Inside were folders stuffed with printed financial statements, handwritten notes, burner phone records, and copies of transfers connected to accounts investigators hadn't even mentioned yet. My hands shook as I flipped through pages covered in Ethan's writing, calculations, timelines, lists of names. Some documents dated back years before Vanessa ever entered our lives. That was the moment the truth finally became impossible to ignore. Ethan's double life didn't begin with the affair. The affair was only a symptom of something much deeper. I sat alone on the office floor, surrounded by evidence, while cold afternoon light spilled through the blinds across the carpet. Every paper seemed to reveal another layer of deception. Small financial manipulations at first. Quiet shortcuts, hidden debts disguised inside corporate expenses, then gradually larger risks, larger lies. It was like watching a man slowly disappear inside his own hunger to maintain control. And the most disturbing part, Ethan had never truly been chasing money. He was chasing identity. Success wasn't something he wanted. It was something he needed to survive emotionally. Suddenly, memories from years earlier came rushing back with terrifying clarity. Ethan obsessively checking emails during vacations. His panic whenever another executive received recognition he didn't. The nights he stared into mirrors adjusting ties before charity events, like an actor preparing for a role. I used to think he was ambitious. Now I realized ambition had quietly transformed into addiction. Ethan didn't know how to exist without admiration, without achievement, without people looking at him and seeing certainty. The affair with Vanessa fit perfectly into that pattern. She wasn't just someone he desired romantically. She reflected back the version of himself he desperately needed to believe still existed, confident, admired, powerful, important. And when his financial world started collapsing, he clung to that illusion harder than ever, even if it meant dragging everyone else down with him. I found one notebook buried near the bottom of the case that disturbed me more than anything else. Most pages contained messy financial calculations, but scattered between them were personal thoughts, written late at night in Ethan's handwriting. One sentence stopped me cold. If I fail, nobody will ever love me again. I stared at those words for a long time because suddenly, everything looked different. The cheating, the manipulation, the endless lies. Beneath all of it was a terrified man whose entire self-worth depended on appearing successful. Not being successful, appearing successful. That distinction destroyed lives. Because once maintaining the image becomes more important than protecting the people around you, morality slowly disappears. Love becomes transactional. Honesty becomes inconvenient. And eventually everyone close to you turns into a tool for preserving the performance. I finally understood something horrifying. Then Ethan hadn't been living as himself for years. He had been acting, performing the role of the perfect husband, executive father, provider. And the deeper reality cracked underneath him the more desperately he performed. Until eventually he couldn't separate the character from the man anymore. Downstairs I heard the front door open softly. Ethan was home. For several seconds, I just sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of his secrets, while one painful realization echoed through my mind over and over. You can survive betrayal easier than discovering the person you loved, never fully existed in, the way you believed. If you think Ethan deserves sympathy after everything he's done, comment number 3 below. Because the next chapter reveals the decision Rachel makes that changes all of their futures forever. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped inside an ordinary white envelope that looked painfully insignificant compared to the life it was ending. I stood alone in the kitchen holding the documents while coffee burned forgotten inside the machine behind me. Outside, spring sunlight poured across the backyard as if the world had already moved on from our destruction. But my hands still trembled when I saw both our names printed side by side for what would probably be the last meaningful time in our lives. Rachel Bennett, Ethan Bennett. 2 people who once promised forever, reduced to signatures waiting at the bottom of legal pages. Strange how quickly entire marriages become paperwork. Ethan was upstairs packing the last of his things into cardboard boxes. Since the investigation intensified, his lawyers advised him to relocate temporarily, while financial charges moved through the court system. Temporarily. Another word people use when they're too afraid to admit something is over. The sound of drawers, opening and closing, echoed faintly through the house, while memories kept crashing into me without warning. Ethan laughing while painting this kitchen years ago. Ethan carrying our daughter asleep from the car after long road trips. Ethan wrapping Christmas lights around the porch badly, while pretending not to notice me laughing at him. That was the cruelest thing about endings. Love doesn't disappear neatly when trust dies. Sometimes memories survive longer than the relationship itself. A few weeks earlier, I returned to working part-time at the hospital. Walking those halls again felt surreal after spending so many years building my life entirely around Ethan's career and our family routines. But strangely, putting my scrubs back on gave me something I hadn't felt in months: clarity. Patients didn't care about scandals or corporate fraud investigations. Sick people only cared whether someone showed up honestly when they were afraid. And after everything I survived, honesty suddenly felt sacred. Ethan came downstairs quietly carrying another box, while I signed the final page of the divorce documents. He froze briefly when he noticed what I was doing. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence between us no longer felt explosive anymore, just tired. "I never thought we'd end like this," he said softly. I looked up slowly. The arrogance was gone now. The image he spent years protecting had completely collapsed under public investigations, financial charges, and endless media attention. His company terminated him weeks ago. Several former colleagues refused to speak to him. Friends disappeared almost overnight, once the scandal became inconvenient. And somehow, despite everything, he still looked shocked by the loneliness surrounding him. "Neither did I answered honestly. Ethan set the box down near the door, before rubbing his hands together nervously. "I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything." "No," I admitted quietly. "It doesn't." Another silence stretched painfully between us. Then finally he looked around the kitchen, one last time, like a man searching for pieces of a life he no longer recognized. "Did you ever love me less after you learned the truth?" That question hit harder than I expected, because deep down, I already knew the answer. "No," I whispered. "That's what made this so painful." Ethan lowered his head after that, unable to meet my eyes anymore. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized something tragic. Losing everything had finally forced him to become honest. But honesty arriving after destruction still leaves destruction behind. Later that afternoon, after he drove away, I stood alone on the front porch, listening to birds sing somewhere beyond the neighborhood trees. The house felt quieter. Smaller somehow, but also lighter, not happy, not healed, just lighter. Like surviving a storm you thought might drown you. Upstairs, my daughter was laughing softly while talking with friends again for the first time in weeks. Inside, the kitchen divorce papers rested, signed beside a cold cup of coffee. And in that moment, I finally understood something that once terrified me: endings aren't always failures. Sometimes they are the first honest thing that happens after years of pretending. A year after the divorce, I saw Ethan again, by accident in the most ordinary place imaginable, the grocery store, near the edge of town, where we used to argue over cereal brands on Sunday mornings. For a second, neither of us moved. He stood near the frozen food aisle holding a basket with only a few items inside, while soft music drifted through the speakers overhead. The first thing I noticed was how different he looked, without the weight of performance crushing him. Simpler clothes, no expensive watch, no polished executive confidence wrapped around every movement. Just a tired man standing alone, beneath fluorescent lights, trying to rebuild a life after destroying the one he once had. And strangely, seeing him no longer hurt the way I expected it to. Time doesn't erase betrayal, but it changes the shape of the wound. Ethan looked startled before offering a small, uncertain smile. Rachel. Hearing my name, in his voice, again unlocked memories so fast it almost stole my breath. Road trips, Christmas mornings, late-night conversations in dark kitchens, before our lives collapsed under secrets and lies. But grief is strange. Eventually your memories stop feeling like knives. Sometimes they become proof that you survived. You look well, he said carefully. I almost laughed at how complicated those words felt between us now. I'm getting there, I answered honestly. And for the first time in years, that statement was true. Life after the divorce hadn't magically become easy. There were lonely nights, therapy sessions, awkward explanations to relatives, financial stress from rebuilding independently, moments where anger returned unexpectedly while folding laundry or hearing certain songs on the radio. Healing was never clean or cinematic. It was repetitive, quiet, slow, but it was real. Ethan glanced down at the basket in his hands before speaking again. I heard you're working full-time at the hospital now. I am. You always loved helping people. That sentence almost broke me, because somewhere beneath all the destruction, Ethan still remembered who I was before his lies consumed our lives. For several seconds we stood there surrounded by strangers pushing shopping carts past us, while an entire history sat silently between our words. Finally Ethan exhaled slowly. I think about what I did every day. There was no self-pity in his voice anymore, no manipulation, just exhaustion and regret stripped completely bare. I know sorry doesn't matter much now, he continued quietly. But I really am sorry. I looked at him for a long moment before answering, because this was the moment I once imagined differently in my darkest nights. I used to dream about revenge, about humiliating him publicly, about making him suffer the same way he made all of us suffer. But standing there now, I realized something important. Pain had already done its work. Ethan lost his marriage, his career, his reputation. The relationship with his daughter would take years to fully heal. Life had already held him accountable in ways anger never could. And carrying hatred any longer would only chain me to the worst chapter of my own life forever. I forgive you, I said softly. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, genuine shock flickering across his face. But before he could speak, I continued. That doesn't mean I trust you again, and it doesn't erase what happened. He nodded slowly, understanding immediately. Because forgiveness isn't permission to return. Sometimes forgiveness simply means refusing to let someone else's mistakes continue poisoning your future. We spoke only a few minutes more before parting ways beneath the cold grocery store lights. No dramatic reconciliation. No impossible romance. Just two people forever changed by the consequences of choices neither of them could undo. As I walked toward the parking lot, snow began falling lightly around the streetlights, and for the first time in years, I felt something unexpected inside myself. Peace. Not because the story ended happily, but because it ended honestly. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside all this pain. People rarely destroy their lives with one terrible decision. They destroy them slowly, through pride, secrecy, ego, and the desperate need to appear perfect. Real love cannot survive where honesty disappears. Trust matters more than image. And forgiveness is not weakness. Sometimes it's the bravest way to finally let yourself move forward. If this story touched your heart, remember this: protecting your peace is never selfish, and the truth always surfaces eventually, no matter how carefully someone hides it.